Hey everybody, today we are going to take a look at types of breaks and joints. We are talking about the skeletal system as well as the muscular system here. And the skeletal system, remember, is not just the bones of the body, but it also includes things like cartilage, which we have in the tip of our nose or in our ears. And it also includes tendons and ligaments. Ligaments are fibrous materials that connect bone to bone, where tendons connect muscle to bone. And so you can have different types of injuries depending on if you have, let's say a slight tear or stretch in a tendon. That's what we call a strain, or a stretch of a ligament, which is called a sprain. So when we talk about injuries, oftentimes they happen at joints. And so there's three different kinds of joints. You have a fibrous joint, which is like sutures in the cranium that have very little movement, but they have extremely strong joint powers. Cartilaginous joint, which has cartilage and is usually for absorbing some type of shock that the weight-bearing bones have. So here you see a diagram of in our back, but we also have some of these in our knees and in our arms. And then lastly, you have a synovial joint, and that's the most common that we have in our body. And that's a joint that connects bone to bone typically, but there is a fluid involved. And so if you have an injury in your knee and they've ever had to drain the fluid, that fluid is typically a synovial fluid that keeps the joint lubricated and able to move relatively easily. So what we're going to talk about is when we have injuries to those bones. Specifically, though, today we're going to talk about the breaks. And so the more mobility that a joint has, the more likely it is for injury. And if you have a lot of mobility, for example, in the ball and socket joints, hip, shoulder, you tend to have more injuries. The more sturdy the bone is, so again, talking about our cranium, you don't really have breaks going on there because that joint is so fused together. So there are different joints as you're seeing here: gliding joint, hinge joint, so we have like in our elbow and in our knee. Pivot joint, we have that typically in our neck that allows us to move our head from left to right. We have the ellipsoid joint, usually found in wrists and ankles, saddle joint, and then ball and socket that we mentioned. So those are the different joints that we have. And again, if you have an injury there, you might have a dislocation where the bone is actually removed from the joint. You might have a strain, which might be a muscle attached to that bone, or you might have a sprain, which is when you stretch the ligament from bone to bone. So let's take a look specifically at the breaks. A green stick is what it sounds like. So if you have a twig that's been sitting out in the sun and it's been dried out, it's easy to break those. If you take a twig that has just fallen off a tree and you try to break it, sometimes you can break one end, but it stays attached on the other. And that's what we're referring to here with the green stick. A spiral sometimes happens with a twisting motion, and oftentimes along the bone, it starts at a high area and then goes to a low, hence the spiral name. Comminuted is one that is a shattering of a bone. And so by definition, it means that it is broken into three or more parts. We see these a lot with car crashes where bones might be shattered. Sometimes these will need to have rods and screws put in order to establish and get those bones to fuse back correctly. Transverse is the most common that we probably see with just like a typical injury. And then a compound fracture is where the bone will actually break through the skin. And those are pretty violent types of breaks, and they do happen. But anytime that it breaks skin, we refer to that as a compound. So this is what they look like with illustrations. Now let's see what they look like if we were to run an x-ray on them. So another one that wasn't mentioned is what's called epiphyseal fracture. This is basically the same thing as a fracture of the growth plate. So it's where the bones of the cells of the bones are growing relatively rapidly. And so along that line of growth, it breaks. And so sometimes these can be a big deal, especially with growing students or growing kids, because if they don't get fused back properly, or if cells start to grow irregularly, you might have one leg that becomes longer than the other, or one arm that becomes longer than the other. And so oftentimes they want to have these checked out via x-ray with especially young individuals. Our next fracture is a green stick. That was the one that was mentioned, where one side of the bone is going to break, where the other one is going to stay attached. And so oftentimes these just need to be set correctly, and usually a cast is involved to make sure that it's somewhat immobilized, and so that open end doesn't reopen where the other one is a little bit more established. Our next one is the spiral. And again, usually this is caused by some type of twisting motion, or can be with some type of twisting motion. What we see here is a break that starts low and then ends up high, and that's an indicator of a spiral fracture. Our next one is a compression. This is one that can be from like blunt force trauma or from some severe contact. It also can be just joints that have too much weight bearing on them. Here you're seeing a vertebrae that has gone through a compression fracture. And so you see how the vertebrae there has been squashed or squished, and that is an indicator of a compression fracture. Oftentimes there's not a ton that they do with these except for immobilization and just making sure that it's steady so that that bone can grow back to normal if at all possible. Something that is also kind of along the same lines of a compression fracture is what's called a depression fracture. And this is more typically found in the head only, where part of the cranium, is frontal bone, parietal bone, is actually cracked and pushed in. Sometimes this does also result in some brain injury. Here again, there's not a ton that we do as far as doctors or medical people to fix that. It just needs to somewhat have time to heal. So you might see a protector over the top just so that the re-injury doesn't happen, or just so that bone fragments don't push into the brain membrane or into the brain itself. And then the last one, and this is the one that it just looks painful, is what we call the communiated. And this is one where, again, the bone is going to break into 3 or more pieces. So oftentimes rods and pins and screws are involved with this, just because it's really hard to have that naturally grow back and grow back to where it should be. So those are our different kinds of breaks. They are different than dislocations, which are where the bone is out of socket. Different joints have different stability. The more mobility it has, the less stable it is. The less mobility it has, the more stable it is. And so that's why we see injuries more likely in some bones than in others. But we also know that there's a genetic component. There's obviously some things where people are more active or less active than others. But today we just wanted to introduce the types of breaks and the kinds of joints that we have throughout our body.